For more than 6 centuries, a silent fire of resentment, betrayal, and spiritual division burned between the peoples who should have been brothers, to peoples who traced their bloodline to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who claimed the same covenant, who read the same sacred law of Moses, yet could not stand the sight of each other. Jews and Samaritans lived close enough that they could see each other's mountains on the horizon, breathe the same desert wind, walk the same dusty roads, and yet they lived emotionally worlds apart. A Jewish traveler heading north would rather suffer the blazing heat of the Judean desert and take a long winding detour around Samaria than allow his feet to touch the soil of a land he considered spiritually contaminated. A Samaritan, spotting a Jew in the distance, would tighten his jaw with inherited bitterness, remembering stories whispered by grandparents about betrayal, destruction, humiliation, and a wound that stretched back so far that no one alive even remembered a time before the hatred. But this journey you are about to hear is not only a story about hatred. It is a story about how God stepped into a broken history that humans failed to fix for centuries. How he walked directly into a 600-year-old wound and began to heal it. With a single conversation, with a sip of water, with a truth that crossed every border humans had built. To understand why Jesus speaking to a Samaritan woman shocked the ancient world, we must return to the beginning, to the moment when one nation became two. Long before Rome marched across the land with iron discipline, before Samaria became a term of insult, Israel was a single kingdom under Saul, then David, then Solomon. But when Solomon died, political ambition and human pride split the kingdom in two. In the south rose the kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem and the Holy Temple, the center of Jewish worship. In the north rose the kingdom of Israel, with Samaria as its capital. Fear drove the northern kings to make one catastrophic decision. They worried that, if their people continued worshiping in Jerusalem, loyalty would shift back to Judah. So they built new shrines, new altars, and introduced practices God never commanded. Slowly, step by step, idol after idol, compromise after compromise, Israel drifted away from the God who had rescued them from Egypt and guided them through the wilderness. God sent prophets to warn them, to call them back, to remind them of the covenant. But their hearts hardened until finally judgment came. In 720 BC, the terrifying empire of Assyria swept into the northern kingdom like a tidal wave of iron and blood. Their armies crushed fortified cities, surrounded Samaria for years, and finally tore down its defenses. Then they did what they were most infamous for. They erased nations. They deported tens of thousands of Israelites and scattered them across distant lands like Babylon, Cuddah, Hamath, and Sepharvaim. These exiles became what historians now call the lost 10 tribes of Israel, tribes that would never come home. But Assyria did not leave an empty land behind. They transported foreigners, people from conquered territories with languages Israel had never heard and gods Israel had never known, and resettled them in Samaria. These foreigners took over abandoned Israelite homes, fields, and towns. They farmed the soil of Abraham, but did not know the God of Abraham. They lived among the poor Israelites left behind. And over decades, identities mixed, traditions blended, and a new people slowly formed, the Samaritans. But this blend was messy. The foreigners brought their idols, and according to 2 Kings, God sent lions among them as judgment. Terrified, they begged the king of Assyria to send an Israelite priest who knew the God of the land. The priest taught them the basics of worshiping Yahweh, but the resulting religion was a hybrid of foreign practices and Israelite tradition. Over generations, the Samaritans abandoned idol worship and embraced strict monotheism. They accepted the Torah, practiced circumcision, honored the Sabbath, and prayed to the God of Israel. Yet one unbridgeable difference remained. Samaritans believed the true place of worship was Mount Gerizim, not Jerusalem. In the 4th century BC, they built their own temple on Mount Gerizim. To the Jews, this was a false temple. To the Samaritans, this was the original sacred mountain chosen by God. The tension grew until it exploded in 128 BC, when the Jewish leader John Hyrcanus led an army into Samaria and destroyed the Samaritan temple. Imagine watching your sacred mountain desecrated. Imagine seeing soldiers tear down the holiest place you had ever known. Imagine the grief, the rage, the humiliation. From that moment, the hatred solidified like stone. Jews called Samaritans half-breeds, impure, corrupted. Samaritans believed Jews had twisted the faith and abandoned God's true mountain. So by the time Jesus walked the earth, the divide was absolute. A Jew would not share food, water, or conversation. With a Samaritan, a rabbi would never speak alone with a Samaritan woman. A Samaritan would avoid Jerusalem at any cost. Yet Jesus the Messiah, who broke boundaries, who touched lepers, who welcomed sinners, who sat with tax collectors, who crossed cultural lines as easily as he crossed the Sea of Galilee, did something no Jew was expected to do before he revealed himself as the Messiah to a Samaritan woman at a well, before he allowed Samaritans to host him for 2 days, before he sent his apostles to preach in Samaritan villages. Jesus stepped into a 600-year-old wound and began the work of restoring a broken family. This restoration begins in the next chapter at a quiet well under the blazing midday sun, where a tired rabbi would shatter centuries of hostility with a single request: "Give me a drink." By the time the sun reached its highest point in the sky, when the heat of the ancient Middle Eastern desert pressed down like a heavy hand and drove most travelers indoors, one solitary figure walked toward a well outside the town of Sychar in Samaria. The air shimmered with heat, cicadas buzzed, and the ground cracked beneath the feet of anyone daring enough to walk at noon, a time when even shepherds avoided the road. But Jesus walked with purpose, not avoiding the region others despised, but heading straight into it. His disciples, tired and hungry, had gone into the town to buy food, an astonishing act in itself. For Jews avoided Samaritan markets and Samaritan bread as if touching them would stain the soul. Yet Jesus sent them anyway, as if orchestrating a moment meant to happen without their interference. Alone now, dusty from the journey, Jesus sat beside Jacob's well, a well steeped in history, a reminder of the shared ancestry Jews and Samaritans pretended not to share. The well that Jacob had dug centuries earlier supplied water to all who came, regardless of tribe, past, or prejudice. And at that well, at the very hour no one usually came, a woman approached with a jar in her hands, her steps slow, careful, almost apologetic, as if she were hoping no one else would be there. She walked not with the confidence of a woman welcomed by her community, but with the hesitance of someone accustomed to avoiding eyes, whispers, and judgment. The scorching noon sun was her cloak, her protection, because respectable women drew water in the cool hours of morning, surrounded by friends, conversations, and laughter. Only those who carried shame came under the burning sun. She lifted her eyes and froze. A man was sitting there, worse, a Jew. She could tell from his clothes, his features, his posture. Every instinct in her body told her to retreat, to turn around, to go home and come back later. Jews did not speak to Samaritans. Jews especially did not speak to Samaritan women and rabbis. They would rather die of thirst than accept water touched by Samaritan hands. She braced herself for an insult, an accusation, a disdainful glare. Instead, Jesus opened his mouth and shattered 6 centuries of hostility with 4 simple words: "Give me a drink." The woman blinked, unsure she had heard correctly. A Jew was asking her, a Samaritan woman, for water. No Jew asked, no Jew received, no Jew shared a vessel. Something was wrong. Something was strange. Something was happening she could not explain. She asked the question any Samaritan would have asked: "How can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink?" It was not an accusation, it was disbelief. She was confronting the impossible. But she did not know that she was speaking to the one who made the seas and rivers, the one who split the Red Sea, the one who created water itself. Jesus looked at her with a calmness she had never seen, as if he knew her, understood her, and saw beneath layers of pain she kept hidden. "If you knew the gift of God," he said, "and who it is who asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." Living water. It was a phrase that stirred something ancient and sacred in her world. Water was survival. Water was life. Water determined the strength of families, fields, and futures. But this man wasn't talking about physical thirst. And yet she clung to the literal meaning, defensive, uncertain, wary. "Sir," she replied, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this?" Well, she emphasized our father, a subtle reminder to this Jewish stranger that Samaritans, too, were children of Jacob. Jesus did not argue. He simply spoke truth, truth that resonated deeper than the stones of the well itself. "Everyone who drinks this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. It will become a spring of water welling up to eternal life." His words struck her in a place she did not expect, a place beyond physical thirst, a thirst of the soul, a thirst she had carried for years, a thirst for acceptance, for forgiveness, for healing, for something she had never been able to name. The woman's heart stirred, and in a desperate, half-hopeful voice, she said, "Sir, give me this water, so I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here." Jesus looked at her, not at her jar, not at her clothes, not at her status, but at her heart. He knew why she came at noon. He knew the shame she carried. He knew the story she avoided. And so he spoke the words that opened her soul like a wild touch for the first time. "Go call your husband and come back." Silence fell between them like a stone. Her breath caught. Her hands tightened around the jar. Pain flickered across her face. "I have no husband," she said. It was technically true, yet incomplete. Jesus nodded slowly, his eyes filled not with condemnation, but compassion so deep it pierced through every layer she had built around her heart. "You are right when you say you have no husband. The truth is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you are with now is not your husband." The words hit her like a blow, yet strangely, instead of humiliation, she felt something else: relief. This man knew her, fully knew her, and yet did not turn away, did not shame her, did not treat her like the outcast she believed she was. For the first time in years, she felt seen, truly seen. She attempted to deflect the conversation toward theology, toward the long-standing debate between Jews and Samaritans about the correct place of worship, Mount Gerizim or Jerusalem. Jesus answered not with geography, but with revelation. "A time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." He spoke of a new era, a new relationship with God, one not built on mountains or temples, but on hearts transformed by truth. The woman, trembling with a mixture of awe and longing, whispered, "I know that Messiah is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Jesus looked into her eyes, the eyes of a woman rejected by her community, wounded by her past, thirsty for something beyond understanding, and he said, gently, directly, undeniably, "I, who speak to you, am he." In that moment, the world around her seemed to stop. The heat, the dust, the loneliness, all of it faded as she stood face to face with the Messiah she had waited for her entire life, the Messiah who chose to reveal his identity not to a king, not to a priest, not to a scholar, not even to his own disciples, but to a Samaritan woman at a well. And with that revelation, centuries of division began to crack. Her transformation had begun, and through her, an entire town was about to witness the power of the one who gives living water. The woman stood frozen at the well, her heart pounding, with a mix of shock, awe, and an overwhelming sense of liberation she had never felt before. The Messiah was standing in front of her, speaking to her, revealing himself not in riddles or parables, but plainly, directly, intimately. And he had chosen her, a Samaritan, a woman, an outcast, as the first person in her town to hear the truth. Just as the weight of that revelation settled upon her, the sound of footsteps approached. Jesus' disciples returned from Sychar, carrying food and dust from the streets they would normally avoid. When they saw Jesus talking with a Samaritan woman, their faces twisted with a mixture of confusion and violation of social boundaries they had been taught since childhood. They did not dare question him out loud, but their silence spoke volumes. Yet Jesus did not look at them. His eyes gently remained on the woman, as if giving her space to respond to the truth she had just encountered. And in that moment, something ignited inside her. The jar, the whole reason she had come to the well, suddenly felt meaningless. She set it down, leaving behind not just the clay vessel, but the shame that had dragged her to this lonely place. Day after day, she turned and ran with a kind of breathless urgency she had not felt since childhood. Ran past the fields and stones and paths she had walked with heavy steps for years. Ran with the water of life now overflowing inside her. She burst into Sychar, the town that whispered about her, judged her, avoided her. But there was no fear in her voice now. She cried out, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did." Could this be the Messiah? Her voice trembled not with shame, but with wonder. The same people who once avoided her now stared at her in astonishment. Something had changed her posture, her eyes, her tone. The heaviness she carried for years had vanished. Curiosity stirred. Murmurs spread through the crowd. People who had not spoken to her in years now leaned forward, captivated by her urgency. Within minutes, groups of townspeople began walking toward the well. a stream of Samaritans heading to meet the stranger who had transformed a broken woman in the span of a single conversation. Meanwhile, the disciples urged Jesus, "Rabbi, eat something." But Jesus, still watching the distant figures approaching from Sychar, replied, "I have food to eat that you know nothing about." Confusion rippled across their faces. They whispered among themselves, "Could someone have brought him food?" Jesus turned to them with a calm authority that cut through their misunderstanding. "My food," he said, "is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work." Then, gesturing toward the fields stretching out before them, fields golden with grain, under the noonday sun, he spoke words they would remember for the rest of their lives. "Open your eyes and look at the fields. They are ripe for harvest." The disciples looked, and for the first time they saw not just fields, they saw people. The Samaritans were coming, a stream of men and women walking toward them with hesitant steps and searching eyes. The harvest wasn't wheat, it was souls. Jesus' face softened with satisfaction, as if witnessing a prophecy unfolding in real time. "I sent you to reap what you have not worked for," he said. "Others have done the hard work, and you have reaped the benefits of their labor." As the Samaritans drew near, their eyes widened with curiosity, suspicion, and a faint glimmer of hope. They had heard rumors of a Jewish teacher performing miracles in distant towns, but none of them ever imagined the Messiah would come to their land, to their well, to speak to their people. The woman who had spread the news stood at the front, breathing hard, but smiling in a way no one had ever seen before. The Samaritans approached Jesus cautiously, unsure how a Jewish rabbi would receive them, but Jesus welcomed them without hesitation. With the same openness he had shown the woman, they asked him to stay with them, an invitation Jews would normally reject without a thought. But Jesus stayed, not 1 night, 2 days, 2 days in a town Jews avoided, 2 days eating Samaritan food, walking Samaritan streets, sleeping under Samaritan roofs, 2 days breaking every cultural line drawn over centuries, 2 days pouring out truth, healing, hope, and living water into people who had long believed they were unwanted by God. And in those 2 days, hearts began to awaken. Men and women who once felt trapped by their past, their religion, their shame, now listened with eyes full of wonder. They asked questions not to challenge, but to understand. They listened not with defensiveness, but with hunger. Jesus spoke of the Father not as a distant deity limited to mountains or temples, but as a God who sought worshipers in spirit and truth. He spoke of freedom, forgiveness, and a kingdom unlike anything Samaria had known. The transformation was slow in some, immediate in others. Yet by the end of those 2 days, something miraculous had happened. The people of Sychar, once divided by centuries of theological argument and bitterness, declared something no Jew expected to hear from Samaritan lips: "We no longer believe because of what the woman said. Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man truly is the Savior of the world, not just the Savior of Jews, not just the Savior of Samaritans, the Savior of the world." And in that moment, the barrier that had stood between these two peoples for generations, built by politics, idolatry, conquest, and hatred, began to crumble. Jesus had not just spoken to a woman, he had opened the door to an entire nation. As Jesus prepared to leave Samaria, the woman stood watching him with a heart forever changed. The town that once rejected her now saw her as the first witness to the greatest truth they had ever encountered. She had gone to the well seeking water and returned with living water overflowing into her entire community, and the disciples, still wrestling with their own prejudices, followed Jesus silently, realizing the boundary lines they clung to were far too small for the kingdom he came to build. As they left Samaritan soil behind, Jesus glanced back at the fields once more. The harvest had begun, and it was only the beginning. When Jesus and his disciples left Samaria after 2 days that changed an entire town, the air still carried the echoes of voices declaring him the Savior of the world. The disciples walked behind him silently, each one processing the shock of what they had just witnessed. They had never imagined that Samaritans, people they were raised to avoid, condemn, and distrust, would not only welcome their master, but listen to him with a hunger deeper than any crowd in Jerusalem. The disciples' sandals crunched against the dry earth as they stepped across the invisible boundary back into Jewish territory. And though nothing physically marked the change, they all felt it. The world they thought they understood was shifting beneath their feet. Jesus walked ahead calmly, his face set toward Galilee, but his heart filled with the knowledge that a spiritual earthquake had begun. For centuries, Samaritans and Jews had been separated by layers of bitterness thicker than the walls of Jericho, but now, because of one woman's testimony and one Messiah's compassion, the barrier had cracked. Yet the path ahead was not simple. When Jesus reached Galilee, a land that had seen his miracles before, he found a welcome different from Samaria's humble openness. The Galileans welcomed him because they had seen the signs he performed at the Passover festival in Jerusalem. They wanted spectacle, power, healing, wonders, but not necessarily surrender. Jesus saw through their excitement as easily as he saw through the Samaritan woman's hidden shame. Faith built on miracles alone would never last. Yet he did not reject them. Instead, he traveled to Cana, the place where he had once turned water into wine, the place where his public ministry had first begun. Word spread quickly. The miracle-working rabbi was back. Crowds gathered with hopes and demands, some wanting healing, some wanting proof, some wanting entertainment. But among them was one man whose desperation outweighed all other motives, a royal official from Capernaum whose son was dying. This man was not a Samaritan, nor a fisherman, nor a farmer, but a man of influence, used to commanding soldiers and servants, used to being obeyed. Yet today, none of his authority mattered. His son lay on the edge of death, and no physician in Galilee could save him. He heard Jesus was in Cana, and hope sparked in him like a fragile flame. He hurried the long journey uphill, each step driven by fear, love, and a father's desperate longing. When he reached Jesus, he did not kneel out of custom, but out of pure collapse. His voice cracked as he pleaded, "Sir, come down before my son dies." It was not a polite request, it was the cry of a breaking heart. The crowd leaned in, waiting for a dramatic moment, a miracle they could witness with their eyes. But Jesus looked not at the dying boy, not at the anxious father, but at the crowd and said, "Unless you people see signs and wonders, you will never believe." The words hung in the air like a rebuke aimed at the entire region. Yet the father did not flinch. He did not argue, nor defend Galilee, nor justify his presence. He simply repeated with trembling urgency, "Sir, come down before my son dies." Jesus' eyes softened. He saw faith not perfect, not fully matured, but genuine. And so he spoke a sentence that would test the man's soul. "Go, your son will live." No gesture, no journey to the house, no dramatic declaration, just a command and a promise. The man froze. His mind raced. Could he trust a miracle he could not see? Could he walk back home with nothing but a sentence from a rabbi, but something in Jesus' voice, something in his presence, pierced through doubt, without arguing, without begging again, without insisting that Jesus come with him? The man simply nodded, turned around, and began the long walk back to Capernaum. Each step was an act of faith. Each mile carried the weight of uncertainty. The road was long, winding, and filled with thoughts that battled inside him. What if nothing changed? What if he returned home to heartbreak? What if he had been foolish to leave without Jesus? Yet he kept walking, holding on to the words, "Your son will live," as if they were the only anchor keeping him from drowning. As dusk approached and he drew closer to home, he saw figures rushing down the road toward him, his servants. His heart pounded, fearing the worst. But as they neared, he saw it in their faces, not grief, but joy. Breathless, they shouted, "Your boy is alive." The father's knees nearly buckled. Tears flooded his eyes as he grabbed the servant's arms. "When?" he demanded. "When did he begin to get better?" The servants answered, "Yesterday. At the 7th hour the fever left him suddenly." The man's breath caught. That was the exact moment Jesus had spoken the words, "Your son will live." In that moment, all doubt vanished. Faith burst into his heart like light flooding a dark room. When he reached home, he embraced his son with a joy words could not describe. And then he gathered his entire household family, servants, relatives, and told them everything. Not just that the boy had recovered, but how it happened, when it happened, and who had spoken the promise. And the entire household believed in Jesus. Back in Galilee, the news spread, but with it came a deeper truth. Samaritans had believed Jesus because of his words. Galileans believed because of his miracles. Yet both were being drawn into the same truth, that the Messiah had come not for spectacle, but for salvation. Meanwhile, the disciples, still processing everything from sicker, now witnessed another truth. The power of Jesus' word alone, spoken miles away, had authority over life and death. They realized the Messiah did not need distance, location, or ritual. His word was enough. And slowly, layer by layer, their own understanding began to expand. They had seen Jesus welcomed by Samaritans more readily than by his own people. They had watched him reveal his identity to a woman society rejected. They had now seen a powerful man humble himself before Jesus and be rewarded with a miracle that required nothing but trust. The kingdom Jesus was building did not resemble any earthly kingdom. It was not for one tribe or one nation, not limited by old wounds or ancient geography. It was for all Samaritans, Jews, officials, fishermen, the ashamed, the powerful, the broken, the hopeful. As the night settled over Galilee and the stars emerged one by one, Jesus looked toward the horizon the same direction that led back toward Samaria, back toward Jerusalem, back toward the places where his mission would soon take him. The disciples did not know it yet, but the healing of a dying boy and the transformation of a Samaritan town were only the beginning. The road ahead would lead them into confrontations, miracles, teachings, and ultimately a cross. But for now, they walked beside the one who spoke life with a word and broke centuries of hatred with a single conversation, and the world, stirred awake by the Messiah's presence, would never be the same again when the royal officials, household believed and joy flooded the walls of his once mourning home. Jesus quietly continued his journey, moving through villages that murmured with rumors of his miracles. The air buzzed with expectation everywhere he went, but beneath that excitement lay something deeper: questions, confusion, and wonder about a man who crossed boundaries no rabbi had ever crossed. The disciples followed him, still trying to understand the pattern of his movements, the choices he made, and the people he was willing to touch. They remembered Samaria, the way he spoke to the woman, the 2 days spent in a land they were trained to avoid, the joy in the faces of people who had once despised Jews. They remembered the royal official, the quiet miracle done from a distance, the authority in Jesus' voice, the way he seemed to see into the very soul of every person he encountered. But as Jesus moved through Galilee, a shadow began to follow him, attention rising among the religious leaders, who heard whispers about him. Some dismissed him as a wandering teacher, some feared him, and some watched him with suspicion. See, in him not the Messiah, but a threat to their authority. Yet Jesus was not driven by the expectations of the crowds or the anxieties of the leaders. His steps were guided by a purpose older than creation itself. And so, he traveled to a place that seemed, at first glance, unrelated to his growing ministry, a pool in Jerusalem called Bethesda. It was a strange place, situated near the sheep gate, surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. The pool was believed to have healing powers, stirred at certain times by an angel, or so the people claimed. Whether the stories were true or not, the place drew the sick, the blind, the crippled, the paralyzed people clinging to the last thread of hope. Day after day they lay by the water, waiting for a miracle they could never reach fast enough. It was here, among the forgotten and abandoned, that Jesus walked quietly, unnoticed by most. But there was one man who had been lying there for 38 years longer than some of Jesus' disciples had been alive. 38 years of hoping, 38 years of disappointment, 38 years of watching others receive the healing he could never reach. His legs were useless, his strength long gone, his dreams had faded into mere survival. Yet he remained by the pool, not because he believed it would save him, but because it was the only place where hope still flickered, however faintly. Jesus approached him, not the strongest man, not the one with enough faith to crawl to him, not a leader, not a righteous man, not even someone who knew who Jesus was. He approached the man who had nothing to offer except a lifetime of suffering. Jesus asked him a question so simple yet so piercing that it cut through all the man's years of resignation. Do you want to get well? The man did not say yes. He did not say no. His answer revealed the depth of his despair. Sir, I have no one to help me into the pool. When the water is stirred, someone else goes down ahead of me. That was his life story in one sentence. I have no one. No family, no friends, no advocate, no strength, no future. But the man did not realize he was speaking to the one who needed no stirred water, no pool, no ritual, the one whose power flowed not from superstition, but from the authority of heaven. Jesus looked at him, a man who could not move, who could not save himself, and simply said, "Get up, pick up your mat and walk." No touch, no ceremony, no explanation. Just a command carrying the weight of divine authority. Strength surged through the man's body, muscles restored, nerves awakened, bones strengthened. For the first time in nearly 4 decades, He felt power flow into his legs, and he stood. He stood, trembling, overwhelmed, amazed, then bent down and lifted the mat that had held him captive for most of his life. He walked each step a miracle the pool had never given him. But the miracle created an immediate storm. It was the Sabbath, and as the man walked through the streets, some Jewish leaders confronted him, ignoring the miracle and focusing only on what they believed was a violation of their law. "It is the Sabbath," they said coldly. "It is not lawful for you to carry your mat." The man, still dizzy with joy, answered honestly, "The man who healed me told me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" "Who is this man?" they demanded, but he did not know. Jesus had slipped away into the crowd. Later, Jesus found him in the temple, and the man learned the identity of the one who restored him. He ran to tell the leaders, not out of betrayal, but out of excitement. He had finally found the healer. But instead of rejoicing, the leaders grew furious. Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. He had acted with authority that challenged their traditions, their interpretations, their power. From that moment on, their opposition hardened. They did not see a miracle, they saw a threat, but Jesus did not shrink back. He spoke clearly, boldly, declaring that the Father was always at work and so was he. The leaders were outraged not only because he healed on the Sabbath, but because he called God his Father in a way that implied equality. The tension that had begun as whispers now crystallized into hostility. The disciples felt the shift. They saw the looks on the leaders' faces, heard the sharp tone in their questions, sensed the storm gathering. But Jesus was not afraid. He continued teaching, revealing that the Father had granted him authority over life and judgment, that those who heard his voice would live, that the hour was coming when the dead would rise at his command. These were not the words of a mere teacher. These were the words of the one who stood outside of time, who commanded angels, who knew every heart. And yet, even as hostility grew in Jerusalem, Jesus did not stop. He traveled, taught, healed, restored, forgave. Every step he took, every word he spoke, every miracle he performed revealed a kingdom that welcomed the forgotten, the Samaritans, the sick, the ashamed, the broken, the powerless. The disciples watched in awe as Jesus dismantled every boundary they had grown up believing in. He touched lepers when others stepped back. He welcomed children when others dismissed them. He spoke with women others ignored. He healed foreigners others despised. The Messiah they followed was not building a kingdom of walls, but a kingdom of open doors. And though the leaders plotted and the shadows deepened across Judea, Jesus continued forward, knowing every act of compassion drew him closer to the cross that awaited him. But for now, his disciples could only follow, their hearts caught between amazement and fear, wondering where this road would lead next, unaware that the greatest revelations and the greatest trials were still ahead. As Jesus continued moving from village to village after the healing at Bethesda stirred outrage among the religious leaders, whispers about him spread like wind across the hills of Judea and Galilee. Some called him a prophet like the ones Israel had not seen in centuries. Others wondered if he could be the Messiah long promised in the scriptures. Crowds followed him, hungry for teaching, for hope, for miracles that broke the laws of nature with effortless authority. But not everyone followed out of faith. Some followed out of curiosity, some followed out of need, and some followed out of suspicion, waiting for a reason to accuse him. Jesus saw through all of it, every motive, every intention, every heart. Yet he continued teaching because the kingdom he carried was for all, even those who did not yet understand him. One day, Jesus climbed a hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee. A vast crowd had followed him, families with children, fishermen with calloused hands, elders leaning on staffs, the sick hoping for healing, the curious hoping for spectacle, the desperate hoping for anything. 5,000 men, not counting women and children, gathered on the grass. The disciples looked at the crowd with growing anxiety. They knew the people had followed Jesus far from their towns and had brought little or no food. As daylight faded and hunger grew, they urged Jesus to send the crowds away so they could buy food in the surrounding villages. But Jesus looked at the weary faces, the mothers clutching hungry children, the old men too tired to walk, the young who had traveled long distances just to hear his voice. Compassion stirred within him. He turned to Philip and asked, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Philip froze. The question sounded impossible. He quickly calculated the cost in his mind, as if numbers might save him. 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. He said, overwhelmed. The other disciples shared his despair. Feeding the crowd was an impossible task, too many mouths, to little money, to little time. But Andrew, always noticing small things others overlooked, stepped forward hesitantly. There's a boy here, he said, with 5 barley loaves and a small fish. But what are they among so many? Barley loaves, the bread of the poor, to fish dried, tiny, barely enough for a small family. The boy's offering was insignificant, laughable even, when measured against the sea of hungry faces. But Jesus smiled. What was small in human hands became limitless in his. He instructed the disciples, have the people sit down. Confused but obedient, they organized the crowd into groups on the soft green grass. Jesus took the boy's simple meal, lifted his eyes toward heaven, and gave thanks. Then he broke the bread and began handing pieces to the disciples. And something impossible happened. The bread did not run out. The fish did not diminish. Hands reached into baskets again and again, and each time the baskets remained full, overflowing, abundant. The disciples moved through the crowd, distributing food that multiplied with every step. Men ate, women ate, children ate, the elderly ate, the sick ate, those who had followed out of faith ate, and those who followed out of doubt ate too. And they did not merely taste, they ate until they were satisfied. Once every stomach was full, Jesus said, gather the pieces that are left. Let nothing be wasted. The disciples filled 12 baskets with leftovers, more than what they began with. The miracle was so overwhelming that the crowd erupted with shouts of astonishment. People began to whisper loudly, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. The excitement surged like a rising tide, a dangerous excitement. The crowd, overwhelmed by the miracle, attempted to seize Jesus and make him king by force, a king who could feed armies, overthrow Rome, restore Israel's glory with supernatural power. But Jesus did not come to become the king they wanted. He was the king they needed, and so, perceiving their intentions, he withdrew to the mountain alone, slipping away from the grasp of people who misunderstood his mission. Evening approached. The disciples, unsure where Jesus had gone, decided to cross the Sea of Galilee by boat, heading toward Capernaum. The water was calm at first, the sky turning shades of deep purple as night settled over the land. But soon, the wind began to howl. Waves rose like dark walls, tossing the small boat violently. The disciples, seasoned fishermen though they were, struggled against the storm. Their arms ached, their hearts pounded. The moon vanished behind clouds, plunging them into near darkness. Every gust of wind seemed determined to overturn their boat. And then amid roaring waves and swirling mist they saw a figure walking on the sea, not swimming, not floating, walking. Terror gripped them. Their minds raced to explain what the eyes could not. It is a ghost, they cried out, fear drowning their voices. But through the storm came a familiar voice, steady, calm, unshaken. It is I, do not be afraid. Jesus walked toward them on the shifting water as if stepping across solid ground. Every wave that threatened the boat bowed beneath his feet. The disciples stared in disbelief, soaked in rain, trembling in fear, yet suddenly surrounded by the peace of his presence. He climbed into the boat, and the wind ceased instantly. The waves settled. The storm, violent only moments before, fell silent like a scolded child. The disciples looked at one another, their hearts stunned by what they had witnessed. They had seen him multiply bread. They had seen him heal the sick. But walking on the sea, mastering nature itself, this was something different, something divine. And in that quiet calm after the storm, they understood a little more clearly who was in the boat with them. The next morning, crowds searched for Jesus again. When they found him, they pressed him with questions, eager for more miracles, more signs, more bread. But Jesus did not come to offer endless earthly provision. He came to offer eternal life. He told them, do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life. He revealed that he himself was the bread of life, the one who satisfies the deepest hunger of the human soul. Many did not understand. Some turned away, but the disciples remained. Though confused, their faith was growing through storms, through miracles, through conversations they barely understood. They followed him because something in his words resonated deeper than anything they had ever known. And as they continued walking behind him through villages, fields, and dusty roads, they realized that every miracle, every teaching, every confrontation was leading them somewhere greater toward a revelation that would shake the very foundation of Israel, Samaria, and the world itself. But for now, they simply walked with him, step by step, learning that the one they followed was not just a teacher, not just a healer, but the Lord over storms, the giver of life, the one who saw beyond borders and reached beyond prejudice. And as the crowd surged and the religious leaders plotted, Jesus continued forward, knowing that the time was coming when his identity would no longer be whispered in small towns, but declared before kings, priests, and nations. After the miracle of the loaves, after the storm Jesus walked across as if it were dust beneath his feet, after the crowds hungered not for truth, but for signs, Jesus continued traveling through Galilee, teaching in synagogues, speaking with an authority that astonished everyone who heard him. But his rising influence drew not only admiration, it drew the sharp, watchful eyes of the Pharisees. They followed him from village to village, listening, questioning, waiting for a moment to accuse him. They did not understand the miracles, but they feared the power he carried. They did not understand his compassion, but they feared the crowds who followed him. Tension followed Jesus like a shadow, yet in the midst of this growing pressure, Jesus did something unexpected. He confronted the deepest traditions of the religious leaders, not with hostility, but with truth so sharp it pierced through centuries of ritual. One day, while teaching, a group of Pharisees and scribes approached him. They had come from Jerusalem, the center of religious authority, traveling miles just to scrutinize him. They watched his disciples closely and finally found what they believed was a flaw. They said, "Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They do not wash their hands before they eat." They were not speaking of hygiene. They were speaking of ritual purification traditions added over generations. Treated as sacred as Scripture, Jesus looked at them with steady eyes and said, "And why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition?" His words struck them like a blow. He accused them of honoring God with their lips while their hearts were far from him, of elevating human rules above divine truth. Crowds murmured. The Pharisees stiffened, insulted, but Jesus did not soften his message. He turned to the crowd and proclaimed, "It is not what goes into a person that defiles them, but what comes out of the heart." With those words, he shattered the foundation of ritual purity the leaders clung to. The Pharisees were furious. The disciples were confused. Peter asked quietly, "Explain the parable to us." Jesus answered, "The things that come out of the mouth come from the heart, and these defile a person: evil thoughts, slander, pride, envy." For Jesus, purity was not about washing hands, it was about cleansing hearts. This teaching, simple yet revolutionary, reached a woman far beyond the walls of Israel, a woman whose desperation would challenge the disciples' deepest prejudices. After leaving that region, Jesus traveled north into the district of Tyre and Sidon, a Gentile land, a territory no faithful Jew willingly visited. But Jesus had come for the world, not just for Israel. As they walked through the outskirts of a foreign town, a woman came running toward them, a Canaanite woman, considered unclean, impure, unworthy by Jewish standards. Her cries pierced the air, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is suffering terribly from a demon." The disciples stiffened. Some stepped back, others looked away. They whispered to Jesus, "Send her away, for she keeps crying after us." But the woman would not stop. She cried out again and again, her voice filled with agony and hope intertwined. Jesus stopped and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." His words were true. His earthly ministry began with Israel, but this woman saw something in him the Pharisees never saw: mercy. She fell at his feet and pleaded, "Lord, help me." Jesus responded with a sentence that seemed harsh, but carried a deeper purpose. "It is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." Any ordinary person would have turned away, crushed, but not her. Her love for her daughter burned fiercely. Without hesitation, she answered, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Her humility, her faith, her determination, Jesus saw it all. He turned to her with a smile rising gently on his face and said, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you." At that very moment, miles away, her daughter was healed. As the disciples watched, stunned, they realized something profound. A foreign woman had shown more faith than many in Israel. Jesus had crossed another boundary. He had healed a Gentile child. Because of a mother's unyielding belief, they continued traveling, and soon Jesus climbed a mountainside near the Sea of Galilee. Great crowds came, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute people society often overlooked. They laid them at Jesus' feet, and he healed them all. The mute spoke, the crippled straightened, the blind opened their eyes to see sunlight for the first time. The crowds glorified the God of Israel. For 3 days they stayed with him, hanging onto his every word, listening to teachings that stirred their souls. But after 3 long days, they had nothing left to eat. Jesus looked at the hungry crowd, 4,000 men, plus women and children, and said to his disciples, "I have compassion for these people. They have been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry." The disciples, still struggling to understand the pattern of his miracles, still blinded by their expectations, said, "Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd?" They had already forgotten the miracle of the 5,000, or perhaps they had not yet understood it. Jesus asked, "How many loaves do you have?" 7, they answered, "and a few small fish." Jesus instructed the crowd to sit. He gave thanks, broke the bread, and handed it to the disciples. Once again, the impossible unfolded. Bread multiplied. Fish increased. Baskets overflowed. Everyone ate until they were full. 7 baskets of leftovers remained. The disciples were left speechless. 2 miraculous feedings, 2 displays of compassion, 2 demonstrations of divine power. Yet they still did not fully grasp who walked beside them. After dismissing the crowds, Jesus and his disciples traveled to the region of Magadan, and there, waiting like hunters in the shadows, stood the Pharisees and Sadducees, groups normally hostile to each other, now united by a common threat. Jesus, they demanded a sign from heaven to test him. Not a healing, not a miracle, not compassion. They wanted celestial spectacle, lightning from the sky, fire from heaven, something to satisfy their hardened hearts. Jesus sighed, a sorrowful sound carrying the weight of their blindness. "You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky," he said, "but you cannot interpret the signs of the times." They asked for a sign from heaven. Yet heaven stood in front of them, speaking, healing, restoring. He left them where they stood, their unbelief unchanged, their hearts still stone. As Jesus and his disciples sailed across the lake, he warned them, "Beware the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees." The disciples, in their simplicity, whispered among themselves, "He must be upset we forgot to bring bread." Jesus looked at them gently but firmly. "Do you still not understand? Do you not remember the 5,000? And how many baskets you gathered? Or the 4,000? How can you not see that I am not talking about bread?" Slowly, like dawn breaking, the truth dawned on them. He was warning them not of physical yeast, but of the teachings, the pride, the blindness of the religious leaders. It was not bread that endangered them, it was unbelief. As the boat rocked gently on the waves and the horizon opened before them, the disciples realized they were being taught lessons far deeper than they expected, lessons about faith, humility, compassion, and the dangers of hardened hearts. And ahead of them, beyond the lake, beyond the villages, beyond the mountains, waited the moment when Jesus would ask them the most important question. He would ever ask a question that would determine the future of the church, the identity of the disciples, and the destiny of the world. But for now, the boat moved steadily through the water, carrying the Messiah and the men who were learning, slowly but surely, that nothing about him was ordinary, and everything about him was divine. As Jesus and his disciples reached the region of Caesarea Philippi, they walked into a land unlike the quiet Galilean villages where fishermen cast their nets and farmers tended their fields. Caesarea Philippi was a place of pagan temples, marble shrines, and carved idols standing tall against the foot of Mount Hermon. Statues of Greek gods towered over the city. A massive cave believed by many locals to be a gateway to the underworld stood nearby, surrounded by shrines dedicated to the pagan deity Pan. It was a place where people mixed superstition, sacrifice, and mythology, a place where Israel's God was ignored or forgotten. Yet Jesus deliberately led his disciples here, not by accident, not by mistake, but with purposeful intention. Here, surrounded by false gods, surrounded by symbols of spiritual darkness, he would ask the most important question of his ministry. As they walked, the disciples observed the city's grandeur with unease. They were far from Jerusalem, far from the temple, far from familiar territory. But Jesus walked calmly, his every step carrying the gravity of what was coming. Finally, he stopped on a dusty road overlooking the shrines below. The disciples gathered around him. The wind whispered through the trees. The sound of distant pagan chants drifted faintly through the air. And then Jesus asked, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" The The disciples exchanged glances. They had heard rumors everywhere they went, from fishermen, from farmers, from travelers, from the curious crowds that followed Jesus. So they answered honestly. Some say John the Baptist. One said, others say Elijah. Another added, and still others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. These were not random names. John the Baptist was seen as a fiery reformer. Elijah was the miracle-working prophet expected to return before the Messiah. Jeremiah was the prophet of tears, confronting the corruption of Israel. People saw pieces of Jesus in each of these figures, but none of them understood the fullness of who he truly was. Jesus listened quietly, but the disciples sensed the question was not finished. And then his gaze shifted from the crowds to the 12 men who had walked with him through storms, through villages, through miracles, through division. His voice lowered, carrying a weight that pressed into their souls. But what about you? He asked. Who do you say I am? Time seemed to stop. The wind stilled. The disciples' hearts pounded. This was not a question of rumors, nor speculation, nor what others believed. This was personal. This was destiny. This was revelation. For a moment, no one spoke. The question hung in the air like a sword dividing truth from confusion. And then Peter, impulsive, passionate, deeply loyal Peter, stepped forward with boldness, ignited by heaven itself. His voice trembled, not with doubt, but with awe. You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. The words fell like lightning, splitting centuries of longing, prophecy, and expectation. Jesus looked at Peter with a mixture of joy and solemnity. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. He said, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. The disciples stared, stunned. Peter had spoken what none of them dared to say aloud. Jesus continued, his voice firm yet gentle. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. His words were directed at Peter, yet echoed through time into eternity. In a land surrounded by pagan temples and idols, Jesus declared the foundation of his own kingdom, a kingdom not built of marble or stone or earthly power, a kingdom built on revelation, on the truth of who he was. And the gates of Hades, the dark shrine standing nearby, would never overpower it. But Jesus was not done. He gave Peter the keys of the kingdom, not of political power, but of spiritual authority. And then he commanded the disciples not to tell anyone he was the Messiah, not yet. The time had not come. The world was not ready. But the next words Jesus spoke shattered their expectations completely. For the first time, he told them plainly that the Messiah must suffer. The Son of Man must go to Jerusalem, he said, and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Silence fell. The disciples were shocked. This was not the Messiah they imagined. They expected victory, restoration, and glory, not suffering, rejection, and death. Peter, unable to contain himself, pulled Jesus aside. Never, Lord, he said. This shall never happen to you. His love was sincere, but his understanding flawed. He wanted a Messiah without a cross. Jesus turned to him, his eyes burning not with anger, but with urgency. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. The words cut deeply. But Jesus was not condemning Peter. He was confronting the temptation to avoid the cross. Temptation as old as the wilderness, a temptation whispered by Satan himself. The disciples stood shaken. Everything they believed about the Messiah was being rewritten. Jesus then spoke to them all, his voice filled with the weight of eternity. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. These were not metaphorical words. The cross was a Roman instrument of brutality. To take up a cross meant surrendering everything, your life, your pride, your dreams. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. The disciples listened, trembling. These were not the words of a political leader. These were the words of a Savior calling his followers into a kingdom built on sacrifice, not conquest. He continued, what good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet lose their soul? The question was not just for them, it was for all generations. And then Jesus made a promise. The Son of Man will come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. He spoke of a future not defined by Rome, not defined by Jerusalem, but defined by the eternal kingdom he carried within himself. As the sun set behind Mount Hermon, the disciples stood in awe, trying to comprehend the weight of everything Jesus had spoken. He was the Messiah, the Son of the living God, the one who would build a kingdom even the gates of Hades could not destroy. But he was also the suffering servant, the Lamb who would be led to slaughter, the Son of Man who would rise again. They did not yet understand the cross. They did not yet understand the resurrection. They did not yet understand the cost of following him. But they would, and soon, very soon, 3 of them would witness a glimpse of his divine glory that would anchor their faith for the rest of their lives. For now, they walked quietly behind him, their hearts trembling between revelation and fear, unaware that a mountain of transfiguration awaited them where heaven would touch earth, and confirm once and for all that Jesus was not merely a teacher, not merely a healer, but the beloved Son of God. 6 days after Peter declared Jesus the Messiah, after the revelation that shook the disciples' understanding, after the shocking prophecy that the Son of Man must suffer and die, Jesus led 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, up a high mountain by themselves. The air grew cooler as they ascended, the noise of the world fading with every step. The mountain loomed in silence, its peak wrapped in clouds like a veil hiding heaven's secrets. Jesus walked ahead quietly, his face solemn, his purpose clear. Yet his companions did not know what awaited them. They followed him because they trusted him, though their hearts still wrestled with his words about suffering and death. They reached a secluded place near the top, where the view stretched across valleys and distant villages. The wind whispered softly, and the sky glowed in the fading light of day. And then, without warning, everything changed. Jesus stood before them, and his appearance began to transform. His face shone like the sun, burning with a radiance no earthly light could match. His clothes became white as light, whiter than any garment ever washed by human hands. The disciples fell back in awe, shielding their eyes, trembling as a wave of holy fear washed over them. It was as if the veil of his humanity had been lifted, revealing the eternal glory he had carried since before the world began. They were seeing not a teacher, not a prophet, not a miracle worker. They were seeing the Son of God in his divine splendor. But the wonder did not stop there. Suddenly, 2 figures appeared beside Jesus: Moses and Elijah, men who had lived centuries earlier, now standing alive on the mountain, speaking with him. Moses, the giver of the law; Elijah, the greatest of the prophets. The law and the prophets standing with the one who came to fulfill them. The disciples stared in speechless amazement. The entire story of Israel stood before them, the past, the present, and the glory of God revealed in the Messiah. Peter, overwhelmed by the moment and desperate to honor what he saw, stammered, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He spoke without understanding, trying to contain the uncontainable. But even as the words left his mouth, a bright cloud descended upon them, thick, luminous, terrifying, a cloud like the one that guided Israel in the wilderness, like the one that filled the tabernacle and the temple, the very presence of God. The cloud enveloped them, and the disciples fell face down in terror. Then a voice, thunderous yet tender, shook the mountain and pierced their souls. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." The voice of the Father, the confirmation of heaven. Not only was Jesus the Messiah, he was the beloved Son of God. The disciples lay trembling until Jesus stepped toward them, his glory veiled once more, his touch gentle. "Get up," he said kindly. "Do not be afraid." They lifted their eyes, and Moses and Elijah were gone. Only Jesus remained. As they descended the mountain, their hearts still trembling, Jesus instructed them, "Do not tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The words puzzled them. Raised from the dead. They could not grasp it. They asked him about Elijah, remembering the prophecy that Elijah must come first. Jesus explained that Elijah had already come in the spirit and ministry of John the Baptist, and the leaders had rejected and harmed him. In the same way, Jesus said, the Son of Man will suffer at their hands. The disciples walked in silence, feeling the weight of destiny closing in around them. When they rejoined the other disciples, a commotion awaited them. A desperate father had brought his demon-tormented son to the disciples, but they had been unable to heal him. The boy convulsed violently, thrown to the ground by an unclean spirit determined to destroy him. When the father saw Jesus, he ran to him and cried out, "Lord, have mercy on my son. He suffers terribly. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him." The pain in the father's voice revealed years of helplessness. Jesus looked at the crowd, at the disciples, at the broken boy writhing on the ground, and said with sorrow, "You unbelieving generation, how long shall I stay with you? Bring the boy to me." The father approached Jesus and said with a trembling voice, "If you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." Jesus turned to him, his eyes filled with both challenge and compassion. "If you can, everything is possible for one who believes." The father's voice broke as he responded, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." It was one of the most honest prayers ever spoken, faith mixed with fear, hope mixed with doubt, and Jesus honored it. He rebuked the unclean spirit. With a violent cry, it left the boy, leaving him lying still as if dead. The crowd gasped, but Jesus took the boy's hand and lifted him up alive, healed, restored. Later, the disciples asked Jesus privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" Jesus replied, "Because your faith is little. This kind comes out only by prayer." It was not a rebuke of their effort, but a call to deeper dependence on God. As they continued traveling through Galilee, Jesus again told his disciples, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life." This time, the disciples understood the words enough to feel grief, but they could not comprehend the resurrection, not yet. When they reached Capernaum, tax collectors approached Peter, asking if Jesus paid the temple tax. Peter, uncertain, yet eager to defend Jesus, quickly answered yes. But when he entered the house, Jesus spoke first. Revealing he already knew the conversation, he asked, "From whom do kings collect duties and taxes, from their own children or from others?" Peter answered, "From others." Jesus said, "Then the children are exempt. But so we do not cause offense, go to the lake, cast a line, and take the first fish you catch. Open its mouth, and you will find a coin. Take it and give it to them." For you and me, Peter obeyed, and the miracle unfolded with quiet precision. Even in mundane matters like taxes, Jesus demonstrated authority over creation itself. But the moment carried a deeper lesson. The Son of God, who owed nothing to the temple, chose humility over offense. And as the disciples settled in the house that night, Peter shared the story with the others, filling them with amazement. Yet beneath their awe, beneath the miracles, beneath the glory glimpsed on the mountain, one truth began to rise within. Their minds like a dawning sun, everything was moving toward Jerusalem, toward confrontation, toward sacrifice, toward the cross. But first, Jesus would teach them what true greatness looked like, not in power, not in status, not in authority, but in humility so deep that it reshaped the very definition of leadership. For now, the disciples rested, unaware that the next teaching would overturn their expectations and prepare them for a kingdom where the greatest is the servant of all. As the disciples settled in the house at Capernaum, still whispering about the glory they had glimpsed on the mountain and the miracle of the coin found in the fish's mouth, Jesus called a small child to himself.